everyone, and welcome to another SmartGrid News webinar. I'm Jesse Berst. I'm your host and moderator today, and we're talking today about how utilities are using cellular communications. And if you haven't spent too much attention to this topic lately, you're going to see there's a lot of change, a lot of progress. I think you'll be impressed. So a very timely topic. We've assembled some experts to get you up to speed on the latest advances, and equally important to understand how cellular technology is being used by utilities right now. I'll introduce each of our panelists in more detail when it's their turn to talk, but just real quickly, I'm Jesse Berst. I'm the Chief Analyst at SmartGrid News, the Internet's oldest and largest SmartGrid site. We're also joined by Jason Ellis and Sunvir Gujral from Qualcomm, the world's preeminent wireless and cellular technology company, and by Jeff Norman. He's the Vice President of Emerging Technologies at SAIC, and he's been part of the implementation team for many of North America's most significant cellular installations, so he's got a lot of value to bring to us today. Here's some of the information you're going to walk away with in the next hour, the roles that cellular can rightly play in the smart grid. A little bit more about cellular life cycle and total cost of ownership, and I think you might be surprised. I was once I started researching this webinar. Also about some of the advances in cellular technology, some use cases, actual real-world applications, a little bit about where we are and what's next, and then finally we will finish up by talking about some of those real-world apps. So let's get started. Let me bring up Jason Ellis from Qualcomm. He's a staff manager for business development there. He's responsible for their Internet of Everything initiative. He's got more than 10 years in the space, previously Director of Business Development and Marketing at Staccato Communications, General Atomics, and Raytheon. He's also been really active in industry working groups around various wireless technologies, including IEEE 1394, the Y-Media Alliance, Bluetooth SIG, and he's got 7 patents already and more in progress. So Jason, thanks so much for coming along.
Jesse, thank you again for having us. It's really quite a privilege to be able to speak to such an audience about the developments and the exciting activity that's happening in the cellular industry and how we can embrace this technology for smart grid opportunities. So just by a quick means of introduction, I won't dwell on this slide, but Qualcomm may not be a household name, but we certainly are a very large established company and significant player in the telecommunications space. Originally accredited with inventing CDMA technology, our founders actually wrote the textbooks on digital communications. 27 years later, we're now powering the majority of smartphone and tablet devices that you're seeing, including maybe some announcements that are happening in the short term. But as Qualcomm continues to participate in consumer electronic devices, especially as the industry matures and we approach the number of smartphones or devices to the human saturation, the entire telecom industry has started to take significant interest in the Internet of Everything, where devices and sensors can benefit from connectivity. And so Qualcomm has established a group within our chipset division specifically to look at these markets. And we're looking at and very active in the automotive industry, in healthcare, and certainly in the energy industry, as well as a few others. So what Qualcomm is doing in SmartGrid, some of it even started before we had a dedicated effort, because our cellular communication technology, as well as some of our connectivity technologies like Wi-Fi, have already come through the ecosystem to a number of different devices, including substation automation, distribution automation, and then all the way into the neighborhood, around the home, and now into the home as well. But I do want to point out on this slide that time-critical applications requiring sub-cycle latency, clearly dedicated communications, including microwave and fiber, still makes a lot of sense. So cellular is not the end-all be-all for communications, but it's certainly very appropriate for a large number of assets. This is actually a slide that I'll spend a few minutes on because people seem to be surprised by the decommissioning of certain older networks. 1G, which was the AMPS analog network, was around actually for quite a long time, from the early 80s, and then at least in parts of the US, started to be decommissioned in the late 2000s. So those networks were up for well over 25 years, probably approaching 30 years. 2G networks, which are now starting in many parts of the world, including the US, and are no longer prevalent at all in Japan, are approaching the end of life. In other parts of the world, they may have a few more years still, but most people don't recognize that they were also installed originally back in 1990s. And so by the time they get decommissioned, they've also got well over 25 years of network longevity. I now step into 3G and certainly the emerging 4G LTE networks. And 3G started in the early 2000s. Certainly we've seen with devices like smartphones and tablets, which are very data consumption oriented, that 3G is really starting to proliferate, and actually it's still a couple years away from reaching its full peak and saturation. So 3G still has a very decent network longevity, and as we recognize, LTE is it now currently in its first several years. Qualcomm is shipping its second generation and has recently debuted and announced our third generation LTE products, which will come to market at the end of the year in consumer devices. But LTE is very much at the beginning of its network life. We have a number of solutions which my colleague Sunvir will discuss, which support 3G in a very price competitive situation, which is even more price conscious today than it had been even a couple years ago, fully backwards compatible to 2G and extensible into 4G. So from a network longevity standpoint, we believe that 3G cellular is very suitable for a lot of long life assets. It's being designed into automotive. It is being designed into smart grid. And over the next few years, LTE will also become a very relevant technology for these long life assets as well. And Qualcomm will certainly do our share to make that technology possible. This slide, total cost of ownership. I recognize that there's a lot of variables that go into this and a lot of different assumptions, which makes this slide a little difficult to do as a generic statement. But one of the key takeaways is we certainly see that cellular is as competitive to RF mesh and to power line communications for WAN technology. And it's going to vary based on geography. It's going to vary based on assumptions on carrier pricing. It's going to vary based on number of endpoints for the RF mesh per collector, as well as how you look at CapEx investment into the infrastructure, and then the ongoing maintenance of a private network and how much that actually really costs. But all said, cellular communications a few years ago were certainly less competitive and really wasn't considered because of the business models that we had. But today, the CapEx that Qualcomm is bringing to the industry is very well suited to compete. And the carriers really want the business, so they've come up with new business models. So once again, what I can say is that the billion-dollar networks that the carriers have created for commercial use is very competitive and should absolutely be considered for your smart grid deployment. I just want to go over a few misconceptions that exist in the marketplace. The first one is, and I kind of touched on it already, that cellular is too expensive, both CapEx and OpEx, and that the carriers aren't interested. And clearly that has changed and in some part was never true to begin with. Certainly CapEx, the price of cellular, the levels of integration, which my colleague Sunvir will discuss, have evolved and are now very cost conscious. Carrier pricing, new business models specifically for machine-to-machine and Internet of Everything, I think they very well take into account the price sensitivities of this market. And then you'll see on one of the subsequent slides that the carriers are doing a lot to really try and embrace the market and meet the specific needs of the utilities. On the next one, private RF mesh networks have negligible operating expenses. We see this as kind of a go-in position when we talk to some of the utilities. They say, oh, well, it doesn't really cost much, or my budget is this. And we believe that they terrifically underestimate what it costs to operate, maintain, and the number of employees required to operate any private network, let alone one that may be RF mesh. So we just caution some of the assumptions that are being made. Commercial carriers are spending billions of dollars every year on network expansion, on ongoing improvements, on network coverage, and most importantly, on security improvements. Security is an ongoing hardware and OpEx investment which can never be let down, and that investment must always continue. On cellular networks having adequate disaster recovery, I'll defer this really to a subsequent slide. Clearly, the cellular networks are very robust. Any instance that they come down, whether for natural disaster or for other reason, they face tremendous regulatory scrutiny, and they must answer for themselves. And there's ongoing tremendous investment in ensuring minimal outage, and after an emergency, very quick restoration times. And they're doing this with portable generators and battery banks and portable and mobile base stations with satellite communications. And we've seen very strong recovery after major hurricanes and also after major events like the great earthquake and tsunami in Japan. In terms of technology maturity, we recognize that some of the technologies of the last decade have certainly been purpose-built for utility needs. And we think that those developments and investments have been very successful, but we definitely want to clarify that technology matures over decades of investment by numerous companies and international standards groups, and we're starting to see that a lot. But cellular benefits from billions of devices actively being used on a daily basis, and we just want to clarify that tens of millions is certainly something that is very successful, but it's different than the billions of devices that cellular currently enjoys in the marketplace. And as we continue to engage as an industry, cellular will continue to improve the technology and make it more suited for applications in machine-to-machine and smart grid in particular, and we've already started to see this. And then finally, as I mentioned on total cost of ownership, that RF mesh solutions, there's various types of assumptions. We definitely see that as the application requirements continue to evolve and that people expect more from their smart grid, that some of these numbers will change, and the total cost of ownership related to some of these networks or private networks will change as well, making cellular even that much more competitive than even it is today.